millions of children grew up laughing at the little rascals. To them, alfalfa, buckwheat, Darla, and the rest never seemed to grow old. But behind those timeless black and white comedies was a series of tragedies so shocking that people eventually called it the Little Rascals curse. The truth, however, is even more disturbing. By the late 1950s, the Little Rascals had become a Saturday morning tradition for millions of children. Every week, another generation watched those same familiar faces, racing through neighborhoods, pulling pranks and making people laugh. What almost none of those young viewers realized was that many of the children on the screen had already died. Some were gone by 16, others never made it past their early 20s. Yet the films kept playing, preserving them exactly as they had been. While the children on screen never seemed to grow older, the lives behind those performances were unfolding very differently. Over the years, people began calling it a curse, but there was nothing supernatural about what happened to these children. The real story began long before the tragedies, inside a Hollywood studio that unknowingly created a system many of its young stars would never escape. And to understand how it all started, we have to go back to 1921. Hal Roach was 30 years old and already rich, which in the Lowe's Angels of that moment meant he was somebody. He had come out of Elmira, New York, by way of Alaska, where he had been a mule skinner and a gold prospector and a truck driver, and he had drifted into the movie business the way a lot of people did then, by standing in the right crowd on the right day. He had made Harold Lloyd into a star. He had a studio in Culver City with his name on the gate. He had an eye, and on the day this story really begins, that eye was being insulted. There was a little girl auditioning in his office. She was, by every account he ever gave of it, a professional. Her hair was in ringlets that had taken somebody an hour. Her face was made up. She had been coached and she recited, and she did the thing that child performers of that era were trained to do, which was to be a very small adult with a very high voice. Roach sat there and watched her and felt something between boredom and irritation, because the child in front of him was not a child. She was an impression of one, done by grown-ups for grown-ups. So he looked out the window. Down below in a lumberyard, some neighborhood kids were arguing. That was all. They were fighting over sticks of scrap lumber, and the smallest one had grabbed the biggest stick and was holding it like a scepter, while the bigger boys circled him and made their case. And none of them were performing for anybody, and none of them knew they were being watched, and Roach could not stop looking. The argument was funnier than the audition. It was not close. That is the moment. That is where every single life in this story turns, including the ones that ended badly. A producer looked away from a rehearsed child and toward a real one, and decided that the real one was worth more money. He would put actual children on film, doing what actual children do, and he would not sand them down into something adorable. And the whole comic engine would be that they were exactly as scruffy and stubborn and unimpressed as the kids in the lumberyard. The idea was not sentimental. It was commercial, and it was correct. He already had a piece of it in place. For a couple of years, he had been using a small boy named Ernie Morrison, billed as Sunshine Sammy, as a kind of good luck charm. In the Harold Lloyd and Snub Pollard pictures, Morrison was black, and he was very good, and Roach had tried to give him his own series in 1921 and run straight into a wall. Theater owners in certain markets simply would not book a picture with a black child at the top of the bill, so the series died before it started, and Roach did the thing that turned out to matter more. He folded Morrison into an ensemble, which meant that from the very first frame, the gang was integrated, not as a statement, as a workaround. The rest of the casting was almost casually done. Nobody scoured the nation. Roach and his people looked around the lot and asked their friends. Mary Cornman was the daughter of the studio's still photographer. Jack Davis was the little brother of Harold Lloyd's leading lady. Mickey Daniels had freckles you could count from the back row, and a laugh like a rusty gate. Jackie Condon had hair that went in every direction at once. Joe Cobb was heavyset and sweet-faced and became the fat kid, because the whole design of the thing was types, one of each, the way a kid actually sorts the neighborhood in his head. And then there was Alan Hoskins, who they called Farina, and who got the job in the least Hollywood way imaginable. He followed Ernie Morrison to the studio one day and stayed for 10 years. The pilot was shot, reshot, red-idled, and shoved out into the world. Pathé released the first of them, one terrible day in September of 1922. Roach had been calling the series Hal Roach's Rascals, but exhibitors and audiences kept calling it by the phrase in the pilot's title. And the audience won, the way it always does. It became our gang. It ran for 22 years, 220 shorts, silent then sound, Pathé then MGM, depression then war. It outlived the careers of most of the adults who worked on it, and it went through children the way a long-running war goes through soldiers, which is to say constantly, and by design, and with a replacement always waiting. Roach put a former fireman named Robert McGowan in charge of directing, and McGowan is the man who really shaped how it felt. He had a theory, and the theory was simple and slightly ruthless. If you give a small child a script, you get a small child reciting a script. So he did not give them scripts, especially not the little ones, most of whom could not read well enough to use one anyway. He would gather them up, explain the scene about a minute before they shot it, tell them roughly where to stand and roughly what they wanted, and then he would get behind a megaphone and run the whole thing live, talking them through it while the camera turned. Silent film made that possible. You could shout at children all day long, and the audience would never hear you. So the laughing was real laughing. The crying was often real crying. The kid who looked genuinely confused was genuinely confused because he had been told what was happening 90 seconds ago by a man with a megaphone, and he was still working it out. The whole texture of our gang, the thing that separates it from every other children's picture of the 1920s and makes it watchable now, is that it is not acting. It is documentary footage of children being managed. That was the gift and that was the cost. And it took 50 years for anyone to notice they were the same thing. Because here is what it meant in practice. These children were not trained. They were used. They were used exactly as they were, at exactly the age they were, for exactly as long as that age lasted. Nobody taught them to hit a mark, or hold a beat, or find a light, because the entire value of them was that they did not know how. Mickey Daniels was hired for his freckles and his laugh. Joe Cobb was hired for his size. Norman Chaney was hired to be a slightly different size. Carl Switzer was hired because his voice cracked in a way that made grown men laugh out loud. And a freckle is not a skill. A cowlick is not a trade. A voice that breaks funny at 8 does not break funny at 19. And when it stops breaking funny, there is nothing underneath it, because nobody ever put anything there. They were paid, and they were paid decently for the time. A newcomer came in around $40 a week, when a lot of grown men in that country were making less than that. The big ones did much better. Farina Hoskins, Spanky McFarland, Alfalfa Switzer, all of them cleared $200 a week at their peak, which in the middle of the Depression was a house, a car, and a family's dignity. What they were not paid was anything else. Ever, not a cent. No residuals, no royalties, no participation in reissues, no share of merchandise, no piece of the syndication that came later and made them famous all over again to a country full of children who had not been born when they made the pictures. They were day laborers with a weekly check, and when the check stopped, everything stopped, and the film went on earning forever without them. Hold on to that. It is the actual curse, and we will come back to it. And by the time we do, you will be able to see it moving through every single one of these lives like a hand under a tablecloth. Their schooling was handled on the lot by a woman named Fern Carter, and she is one of the quiet heroes of this whole business. She started in the fall of 1922, and she stayed until the series ended, around 1944. 22 years of teaching a rotating cast of movie children in a schoolroom on a comedy lot, and she was not soft about it. The law said 3 hours a day. She got 3 hours a day. If that meant production stopped, and a director stood around burning money, while an 8-year-old finished his arithmetic, then production stopped. She traveled with them on promotional tour. She stayed in touch with them for decades after they left, into their 40s and 50s, long after the world had stopped calling. For a lot of these kids, Fern Carter was the only adult from that period who ever wanted anything from them other than a performance. 3 hours a day is the legal minimum. It is not an education. It is a receipt for one. Roach himself was better than his industry, which is a low bar he still managed to clear. He required a parent on the lot, and then he made rules to keep that parent from interfering, which tells you exactly what he thought parents were for, and exactly what he thought they were capable of. There is at least one occasion where he went to court to stop a father from treating his own child's earnings as pocket money. He was not a monster. That matters because the easy version of this story wants a monster, and there isn't one. The children mostly remembered the lot fondly. They had the run of it between setups. They were treated like small royalty by the crew. Sidney Kibrick, who played the bully's sidekick and lived to be 97, remembered days that ran 6 hours and days that ran 16. But he also remembered it as the best time of his life, and so did most of them. And they said so on the record for the next 60 years. The place was not cruel. The place was temporary. That is a different kind of damage, and it is much harder to see coming. There was no law then that could have protected them from it. Entertainment work sat outside the federal child labor rules almost entirely. California asked for a work permit and asked that the schooling continue and largely left the rest alone. The one real reform arrived in 1939 when the state passed the Child Actors Bill, the law everybody calls the Coogan Act, and it arrived because Jackie Coogan had grown up and discovered that his parents had spent nearly everything he had ever earned. The law let a court order that some of a child's money be set aside in trust. 1939. The series had been running for 17 years by then. Most of these children were already finished. So that is The World. A comedy lot in Culver City with a schoolroom and a megaphone and a payroll clerk. Children hired for the accident of how they looked at 7, taught the legal minimum, paid a weekly wage with no back end, and replaced the moment their faces changed. Now let us go find out what happened to them. The first one to go was a boy who had been hired for his body and was eventually killed by the treatment for it. His name was Norman Chaney, and America knew him as Chubby. Is that the thing which got him? The job was the thing that was already killing him. Nobody knew that yet. Not the studio, not his mother, not the doctors, and least of all Norman, who at 14 was mostly thinking about how strange it was to be famous. He came from Cambridge, Maryland, a town on the eastern shore where nothing happened, and he came into the series through the front door, which almost nobody did. In 1929, Joe Cobb was aging out. Cobb had been the round-faced boy in the gang since the silent days, and he was getting tall and getting ordinary, and the character needed a new occupant, so Lowe's Theaters ran a nationwide contest to find one. Thousands of families put their children forward. Somebody at a Lowe's house in Maryland looked at a short, wide, sweet-faced boy from Cambridge and thought that one. He was 3 feet 11 inches tall and weighed about 113 pounds. He was around 14 years old, though the studio quietly shaved years off that in the publicity, because a 14-year-old who looks like a 9-year-old is a curiosity, and a 9-year-old who looks like that is a comedy character, and Hollywood has always known the difference. Robert McGowan looked him over and named him Chubby. That was the whole audition, essentially. His body was the resume, and he was good. That is the part people skip. He debuted in an early talkie called Railroadin' in 1929, and over the next 2 seasons, he made about 19 of them, and he could actually play. Edgar Kennedy, the great slow burn comedian, took an interest and taught him how to do it, how to let an insult land, and then let the face register it in stages. First blank, then hurt, then furious, all without a word. That is not something you get from a fat kid off a contest form. That is craft, taught by a professional to a child who was paying attention. You can see it best in a short called Love Business, from 1931, where the whole gang is in love with the schoolteacher, Miss Crabtree, and Chubby is competing with Jackie Cooper for her attention. That has been quoted by people who cannot name a single other thing he did. He is genuinely funny in it. He is timing it. He knows what he is doing. He also did Boxing Gloves, where he squared off against Joe Cobb, the boy he had been hired to replace, which is about as blunt a piece of symbolism as the movie business ever accidentally produced. The old fat kid and the new fat kid in a ring for laughs. Then it ended the way it always ended. After the 1930 to 1931 season, his contract simply was not renewed. He was growing, not up particularly but out, and in ways that were starting to look less like comedy and more like something wrong. The series was also going through one of its periodic overhauls. He and his parents talked it over and decided together not to chase more film work, and he went home to Baltimore and enrolled in public school, where by every account he did extremely well, which is not nothing for a boy who had spent 2 years being told his job was to be looked at. For a little while, he did the thing that former child performers of that era did. He took vaudeville bookings in 1932 and 1933, standing on stages in Baltimore and Washington, and out through the Midwest and California, telling stories about what it had been like on the lot. A boy of 18, being paid to remember being 14. There was talk of another series for him. It never came together, and then his body started running away from him. The condition was glandular, an endocrine disorder, and it had been there the whole time, quietly explaining everything. It was why he was short. It was why he was heavy. It was why he had gotten the part. He ate a normal diet. He was an active kid. None of it made any difference. After he left the pictures, the weight climbed and climbed, past 200, past 300, while his height stopped dead somewhere around 4 feet 7. By the middle of the decade, he was having real trouble walking. In 1935, they took him to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and the doctors there went after the glandular problem directly, with treatment that included surgery. It worked. That is the terrible part. It worked spectacularly. The weight came off him like water out of a bathtub, from more than 300 pounds down under 140. Newspapers at the time reported him at 4 feet 5 and 133 pounds, and noted that he was still having difficulty getting around. By the end, he was near 110. In a matter of months, a body that had spent 20 years building itself one way was disassembled, and a heart that had spent 20 years learning to move 300 pounds was suddenly attached to a frame a third that size. His system could not take it. He got sick and did not get better. There was another operation. He did not rally. Norman Chaney died in Baltimore on the 29th of May, 1936. He was 21 years old. The death certificate said myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle, and everyone involved understood what had actually happened, which was that the cure had been more than the body could survive. The New York Times ran a short obituary a couple of days later, the kind of thing that fits in a column and a half. "Fat boy of our gang," it said, more or less. That was the headline of his life. At 21, in the paper of record. He was the first of them. The series was still in production when he died. It had 8 more years to run, and shorts were still being made in Culver City, and children were still being hired and named and photographed. And one of the boys who used to be in it was already in the ground in Baltimore, and almost nobody in the building knew. His mother buried him in Baltimore Cemetery and could not afford a headstone, so there was no headstone. Not for a year, not for 10, not for 50. Norman Chaney lay in an unmarked patch of Baltimore ground for 76 years, while the shorts he had made played on television every afternoon in every city in the country, while children who had not been born when he died learned to say Chupsy Upsy, while somebody somewhere collected money on the reissues and the syndication packages and the merchandise. 76 years. In 2012, a group of fans on the internet, led by a musician who went by Mikal, raised the money and put stones on both graves, his and his mother's, 2 people who had been lying anonymously in the dirt for the better part of a century, finally got their names written down because strangers who liked an old movie decided it was not right. That is the first one, hired for a body that was already failing, cured by a treatment that finished the job, dead at 21, and forgotten for 3/4 of a century in a grave nobody marked. You can see why the list starts here. You can also see, if you look at it straight, that there is nothing supernatural anywhere in it. There is a sick child whose sickness was mistaken for a personality, and medicine that was doing its best in 1935, with tools we would call primitive now, and a family with no money. That is not a curse. That is the 20th century. The next one is not a curse either. It is something else that was going around in those years, and it took a great many boys who had nothing to do with Hal Roach. Every version of the gang needed a smallest one, and for 6 years running, the smallest one was a boy named Bobby Hutchins, whom the audience knew as Weezer. His whole function on screen was to be too little. He was the one trailing after the big kids, the one who wanted to come along, the one who got told to go home and did not go home. He had a soft, breathy voice, which is where the name came from, and a face built for looking up at people. He made 58 of them between 1927 and 1933, which is a serious run, and he was in the series through the entire transition from silent to sound, which means his voice is one of the first our gang voices most of the world ever heard. He was 3 when he started. He was 8 when he finished. Think about what that means for a second. He did not remember not being in the movies. There was no before. He was a working performer at an age when most children are learning to tie their shoes. And then it was over, and he was still a small boy, and there was nothing to do but go home. Home was Tacoma, Washington. That is where he went. And by every account, he went there and simply became a person. He finished school. He was normal. He had friends and grades, and a mother who kept the clippings. He did not try to claw his way back into pictures the way some of them did, and there is no evidence he much wanted to. What he wanted, it turned out, was to fly. In 1943, he joined the Army Air Forces as an aviation cadet. He was 18. The country was 2 years into the war by then, and it was eating young men at a rate that is difficult to sit with now. And the ones who volunteered for flight training were volunteering for the most dangerous version of it. And they knew that, and they lined up anyway. Bobby Hutchins lined up. He trained. He was good enough to keep going, which many were not. He worked his way to the end of the pipeline, to the last stretch before he would have pinned on his wings and been sent somewhere real. His graduation from flying school was coming. His mother had made arrangements to be there. On the 17th of May, 1945, he was flying an AT-6 Texan at Merced Army Air Field in Central California, the base that would later be renamed Castle. The Texan was the standard advanced trainer, a single-engine machine that a generation of American pilots learned to handle before they were trusted with anything with guns on it. He was landing. Another AT-6 hit him. Midair on the approach, 2 trainers occupying the same piece of sky over an airfield in the San Joaquin Valley. The other pilot lived. Bobby Hutchins did not. He was 20 years old. The date is the part that stays with you. The war in Europe had ended 9 days earlier. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May, and the whole country had poured into the streets. And the Pacific was still burning, and there was still a job to do. So training went on, and boys kept going up in Texans over Merced, and one of them came down. His mother had a ticket to a graduation. She got a telegram instead. There is no version of that story in which a curse is doing any work. That is the year 1945 in the United States of America. Thousands of American airmen died in training accidents on home soil during that war. In California and Texas and Kansas, on runways and in fields and in the ocean off the coast, and almost none of them had ever been in a movie. Bobby Hutchins died the ordinary death of his exact generation. The only thing unusual about it is that we have footage of him at 6. He was not the only one from that lot who went, either. Donald Haynes had been in the shorts in the early 1930s, one of the second wave, one of the ones whose names never quite stuck the way Spanky and Alfalfa stuck. He was born in the spring of 1919. He grew up and became a pilot too, and he did not die in training. On the 20th of February, 1943, Donald Haynes was killed in action in North Africa in the fighting around Kasserine Pass. He was 23. Kasserine was the first real collision between American ground forces and the German army, and it went badly. And it went badly in the specific way that first battles go badly, which is that everybody involved discovered at once how much they did not know. American units were overrun. The line broke. It took a week and a change of commanders to get it back. Somewhere inside that week, a young man who had once been a face in a comedy short about kids and dogs was killed in a place he had probably never heard of before the army sent him there. 2 boys out of one comedy series dead in uniform, 20 and 23. Anyone who puts those 2 names on a list of cursed children has misunderstood the 20th century so completely that it is hard to know where to start. That is not a shadow following anybody off a soundstage in Culver City. That is the same war that took 400,000 other American sons. And it took these 2 the same way it took the rest. And their mothers grieved the same way the other mothers did, in kitchens with a folded flag. If you want to be honest about the list, And being honest about the list is the whole point of this. Then here is a number worth holding on to. Nearly every boy who ever appeared in our gang in the 1920s and 1930s was of exactly the right age to be drafted. All of them, the entire cast, aged into the exact window. It would have been remarkable if none of them had died. But the list does not care about that. And there is a reason the list does not care. And we will get to who built it and why. For now, there is a smaller and stranger death coming, and it belongs to a boy who invented his own voice and then lost everything else. There is one child in this whole story who built the thing that made him famous entirely by himself, out of nothing, in his own bedroom, before anyone in Hollywood had ever heard of him. Billy Loughlin was born in San Gabriel, California, in the summer of 1932, and he was not a natural performer. He was the opposite. He was a shy boy with slightly crossed eyes who wore glasses so thick they made his eyes look like they belonged to someone larger, and he knew what he looked like. And children in 1938 were not gentle about that sort of thing. His mother worried about him. She did what a certain kind of mother does, which is to try to build the confidence from the outside in, and she signed him up for drama classes. Somewhere in there, he started doing a Popeye impression. That is where the voice came from. Not from his throat, not from a condition, not from anything he was born with. He listened to a cartoon sailor, and he taught himself to make that noise, the low grinding croak that sounds like a hinge with an opinion, and he got good at it. And it was the one thing he could do that nobody else in the room could do. A shy boy with a party trick. It is the oldest survival strategy there is. An MGM talent scout heard it. They gave him a screen test, and the reaction was strong enough that the studio put him under a term contract. And in April of 1940, he turned up in a short called The New Pupil, billed as Harold, which was his real middle name, and which nobody ever used again. Within weeks he was Froggy and only Froggy, and he would be Froggy for the rest of his life, which was 8 more years. He made 29 of them. He came in as a supporting player to Alfalfa Switzer, who was in his last stretch, and when Switzer aged out and left, Froggy moved up into the center of the thing. The directors were smart about the voice. They rationed it. He would go a long stretch of a short without saying much, and then that croak would come out of him at exactly the wrong moment, and the theater would come apart. Every time. It never stopped working because they never let it get tired. The people around him liked him. Robert Blake, who was in those same late shorts as a kid and who would grow up to have a life so complicated that we will have to come back to him, said years later that Billy Loughlin was dearly loved. That is not a phrase people use about difficult children. In 1944, MGM shut it down. 22 years, 220 shorts, and the final one was called Dancing Romeo. And the last spoken line in the entire history of our gang came out of a 12-year-old boy, doing a voice he had made up to stop other children from teasing him about his glasses. Then he went home. There is exactly one other credit on his record. A small part in a monogram feature called Johnny Doesn't Live Here Anymore, made the same year, where he plays a boy named Jerry Malone. It is the only time on film that anyone ever heard Billy Loughlin speak in his own voice. One picture, a few lines, in the voice he was actually born with, which nobody had ever been interested in, and which most of the audience would not have recognized as his. After that, he was done, 12 years old and retired, back in the La Puente area east of Los Angeles, an ordinary teenager with thick glasses. He got a paper route. That was the job. He rode around in the early morning, in a suburb of orange groves and new tract houses, throwing newspapers onto porches. And by 1948 he was 16, and his parents were pleased enough with how he was turning out that they bought him something, a Cushman motor scooter. 2 weeks before, on the 31st of August 1948, Billy Loughlin was on that scooter with his friend John Wilbrand, who was also 16. Wilbrand was driving. Billy was riding behind him with the papers. They were on Valley Boulevard between 7th and 8th, in La Puente, working the route. Wilbrand turned. A U-turn in the road the way a 16-year-old on a scooter, with a friend on the back, will do without thinking about it because he has done it 40 times. Coming the other way was a truck. The driver was 25 years old and his name was Paul Otto Baumann, and he was moving faster than he should have been on a residential street, and there was nothing left of the distance between them. By the time either of them understood what was happening, the scooter went out from under them. Billy Laughlin was thrown roughly 40 feet down the road. They got him to Covina Hospital. He died there the same day of hemorrhage and shock. John Wilbrand walked away with scratches. Paul Baumann was not held by the police. He told them he had not been able to stop in time, and that appears to have been the end of it. The local paper, the La Puente Valley Journal, ran it on the 2nd of September under the words "Youth dies from injuries." The Los Angeles Times gave it a line or two, "Crash kills youth of 16." Both mentioned that the boy had once been in the Our Gang comedies. There was no national coverage and no outcry, because in 1948, a teenager killed on a motor scooter was a traffic item, not a story, and the only thing that made this one different was a detail in the 3rd paragraph. He is buried at Rose Hills in Whittier. His mother and father are there with him now. He was 16. Of every child who ever appeared in that series and then left it, Billy Laughlin died the youngest, and he died 4 years and 1 month after speaking the last line of the whole enterprise. When they remade the pictures for a new generation in 1994, they cast a boy to play Froggy and dubbed his voice, because no child in 1994 was going to teach himself that croak off a Popeye cartoon in his own bedroom. They had to fake what a shy boy in San Gabriel invented for free. Nothing followed him home. A friend turned into traffic. That is the whole of it, and it happened that same afternoon to other boys in other towns, whose names nobody wrote down. But the deaths were beginning to stack up now, and one more was coming before the decade closed out. And this one happened in a hotel room in Los Angeles with a cigarette in it. Almost none of them made it as adult actors. That is the flat truth of the whole business, and it makes the handful who did stand out sharply, and it makes what happened to one of them harder to file away. Clifton Young was in 19 of the shorts across the second half of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, and he was hired, like all of them, for a physical fact about his face. His teeth stuck out, he was gangly and knock-kneed, and had a mouth that seemed to arrive before the rest of him, and the crew called him Bone Dust, and that is what he was billed as, and that is what he answered to for years. He was a background boy. He was never a lead the way Farina was a lead or Spanky was a lead. He was the one in the 3rd row of the gag, doing the reaction, and if you have watched those pictures, your whole life you know his face perfectly well without ever having known. There was a name attached to it. And then, unlike nearly every other child on that lot, he grew up and kept working. That is genuinely rare. He got taller and lost the look, and did the thing almost none of them could do, which is convert a childhood on a comedy lot into an adult trade. Through the 1940s, he was a working character man at Warner Brothers, the kind of face that turns up in the second act with bad news. His best remembered stretch is in Dark Passage in 1947, where he plays a cheap blackmailer who makes the mistake of trying to squeeze Humphrey Bogart on a dark road, which does not go well for him. It is not a large career. It was a career. He was employed. He was in real pictures. He had made the crossing that broke almost all of his contemporaries. If you were assembling a list in 1950 of our gang alumni who had come out of it fine, Clifton Young would have been near the top of it. On the 10th of September, 1951, he was in a hotel room in Los Angeles, and he fell asleep smoking a cigarette. The room caught. He did not get out. He was 33 years old, and his birthday would have been 5 days later. That is it. That is the entire mechanism. A man alone in a rented room with a cigarette, in a decade when nearly every adult in the country smoked, and nearly every mattress in the country would burn like a haystack, and a fire that started while he slept. It was one of the ordinary ways to die in America in 1951, and it happened to men in hotel rooms in every city in the country that year. But he was on the list. He went on the list the moment somebody started keeping one, because he had been in our gang, and because 33 is young, and because a fire in a hotel room sounds like something rather than nothing. 4 of them gone now. A boy in Baltimore, whose treatment killed him at 21. A cadet who fell out of the sky over Merced at 20. A pilot killed at Kasserine at 23. a teenager thrown 40 feet down Valley Boulevard at 16, a character actor burned in a hotel room at 33. And in that entire span, from 1936 to 1951, not one person in America connected them to each other. Not one newspaper ran a piece asking what was happening to the children from our gang, because nothing was happening to them. Individual people were dying individual deaths in a country where people died a great deal younger than they do now. It took one more, 8 years later, to give the story its shape. And that one had everything. It had a knife that may not have been a knife, and a 14-year-old boy who saw the whole thing and was never asked to testify, and a fight over $50 and a dog. The most famous singing in the history of our gang is bad singing, and the boy doing it was a genuinely gifted musician. That is the joke at the center of Carl Switzer, and it is not a small one. It is the whole shape of his life in one sentence. He got rich and famous by being terrible at the one thing he was actually good at. And then he spent 20 years trying to be taken seriously by an industry that had already decided what he was. He was born in Paris, Illinois, in August of 1927, the youngest of four. The Switzers were not comfortable. His father had lost a foot in an accident and had a hard time finding steady work after that. And money in that house was a subject. The way it is in a lot of houses in a small Illinois town in the years, the whole country came apart. What the family had instead was music. Carl and his older brother Harold could both sing and both play mandolin and guitar and whatever else got put in front of them. And they were good enough that people in Edgar County knew their names. They worked fairs. They worked the carnival circuit. Two boys, maybe 8 and 6, standing up in front of a crowd of farmers in the summer heat and performing for real money because the family needed it. In 1934, the Switzers drove out to California to visit relatives, and being tourists, they took the public tour of the Hal Roach Studios in Culver City. When the tour was over, they went into the studio's public cafeteria, a room the studio actually called the Our Gang Cafe, and the two boys did what they had been doing for years without being asked. They started performing. Hal Roach happened to be sitting in that room. He signed both of them. Harold got 2 nicknames, Slim and Deadpan, and never really got a character. Carl got Alfalfa and a cowlick, and instructions to sing off-key on purpose. Their first short together was Beginner's Luck in 1935. Harold played mandolin. Both boys sang She'll Be Common Round the Mountain. Within months, the world knew exactly which of the two brothers it wanted, and it was not the one with the mandolin. That is a hard thing to have happened inside a family. At 8 and 10, in public on film, Alfalfa became one of the 2 or 3 most recognizable children in America. The freckles, the cowlick standing up like it was reaching for something, and above all that voice, cracking and swooping and missing every note it aimed at, while the boy's face stayed absolutely serious, because the character believed he was beautiful. Roach and the directors understood immediately what they had. He was not a kid pretending to sing badly. He was a genuinely good singer, executing bad singing with total precision, which is a much harder trick, and which is why it still works 90 years later. He was pulling down $200 a week and change at the height of it, in the middle of the Depression, and it went home, and it kept the family upright. Then in 1940 he turned 12, and his face started to change, and MGM let him go, 12, fully formed as a public personality, completely unformed as anything else, and unemployed. What followed was 20 years of a man trying to get out from under a boy. He worked, that has to be said plainly, because the easy story is that he never worked again, and it is not true. He kept getting hired. He was in I Love You Again in 1940, and Johnny Doughboy in 1942. He is in Going My Way in 1944. He is in It's a Wonderful Life in 1946, as Donna Reed's date at the high school dance, the jealous kid who cranks open the floor over the swimming pool, while Jimmy Stewart is doing the Charleston, which means that every December for 80 years, millions of people have watched Carl Switzer be the reason for one of the most beloved scenes in American film, without having the faintest idea who he was. He did Pat and Mike in 1952. He did 3 pictures for William Wellman in the middle of the decade, including Track of the Cat in 1954, where for once he got an adult character to play and knew it, and was proud of it. He turned up on the Roy Rogers show half a dozen times. He did Burns and Allen. He took an uncredited bit as a slave in the Ten Commandments. And his last picture was the Defiant Ones in 1958. 60-odd films, almost all of them small and a great many of them uncredited, and none of them able to do the one thing he needed, which was to make an audience look at him and not see a cowlick. He knew exactly what the problem was. On his resumes, when he had to account for the years between 1935 and 1940, he did not write Our Gang. He did not write Alfalfa. He wrote something like MGM Short Product, a phrase so bloodless it is almost a wound. And he wrote it because he understood that the single most famous fact about him was the thing keeping him out of every casting office in town. The money went the way it goes. He tended bar. He guided hunting and fishing parties up in Northern California and around Los Angeles, and he bred and trained hunting dogs, and he was good at it. And the client list tells you something about the man's charm and something about his position. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans used him and liked him enough to stand as godparents to his son. James Stewart used him. Henry Fonda used him. Think about what that felt like. You are 30 years old. You are taking money from Henry Fonda to train his dog. In 1955, the old Roach Sound shorts went into television syndication under the name The Little Rascals, and the country fell in love with them all over again, and a whole new generation of children learned to imitate that cracking voice. And Carl Switzer received nothing, not a dollar. He was the most recognizable face in a package of films playing every afternoon on every station in America, and his phone did not ring, and no check ever came. He married in 1954. Her name was Diane Collingwood, and her family had money in Kansas grain elevators, and their son was born in 1956. Her people offered them a farm near Pretty Prairie, Kansas, and Carl tried it and he hated it, and he came home to California. The marriage ended in 1957. His former wife remarried, and the boy grew up for years not knowing who his biological father had been. By then the last part was already in motion. In January of 1958, he was getting into his car outside a bar in Studio City, and someone shot him in the upper right arm. The gunman was never found, and no reason was ever established. A former child star was shot in a parking lot in the San Fernando Valley, and it did not make much of a ripple. That December, he was arrested in Sequoia National Forest for cutting down 15 pine trees to sell as Christmas trees. He got a year of probation and a $225 fine. That is the man in his last winter, 31 years old, bartending, guiding breeding dogs, recently shot by a stranger, on probation for felling government pines to sell on a corner, and playing every day on television for free, in front of an audience of millions. And then there was the dog. It belonged to a man named Moses Stilts, who everybody called Bud. Switzer knew him from around the edges of the picture business, from Corriganville, the movie ranch out in Simi Valley, where 100 westerns got shot, and from the Roy Rogers productions, where a man who could handle animals could always pick up a day's work. They were not enemies. They had done business together. Stilts had a treeing Walker coonhound, and in 1958 he gave it to Switzer to handle. Somewhere in there the dog got loose. The accounts differ on how. One version says it went off after a bear. One version says it simply vanished on Switzer's watch, which is the part that mattered, because it was Stilts' dog, and it had disappeared while Carl Switzer was responsible for it. Stilts wanted the dog, or he wanted the money. So Switzer did what you do. He put up posters, he placed ads. He offered a reward out of his own pocket, because he had no dog to hand back, and he was not in a position to write a check for the value of a hunting hound. And it worked. Somebody found the dog and brought it to the bar where Switzer was working, and Switzer paid him $35 in cash and about $15 in drinks. Call it $50. $50 in January of 1959. And Carl Switzer, 31 years old, broke, shot at on probation, and playing on television every afternoon for nothing, sat there and did the arithmetic and decided that this was not his $50. It was Stilts' dog. Stilts should pay it. That is not an unreasonable position. That is the position of a man who has been quietly getting the short end of every transaction in his adult life, and has decided on this one small thing, with a number small enough to actually collect, that he is going to be made whole. On the evening of the 21st of January, 1959, he drove out to Mission Hills with a friend named Jack Piet, a unit still photographer, to get his $50. The house was on Columbus Avenue. Inside were Bud Stilts and Stilts' 14-year-old stepson, a boy named Tom Corrigan. What happened in the next few minutes has never been settled, and there are two accounts of it, and they do not agree about the one detail that decided everything. Here is what Stilts said. Switzer came pounding on the door demanding money. He got inside, one way or another. There was a struggle, and either Switzer or Piet hit Stilts on the head with a glass-domed clock. Stilts backed away, got hold of a .38 caliber revolver, and came back with it, and Switzer came at him with a knife and said he was going to kill him. In the struggle over the gun, it went off once, and the shot came close enough to the 14-year-old boy to injure him slightly. And then Stilts fired again and hit Carl Switzer in the groin, and the bullet cut an artery, and Switzer bled to death internally before they got him to a hospital. Self-defense. A man in his own home hit with a clock threatened with a knife. Here is what the 14-year-old said. Tom Corrigan told investigators at the time, and repeated it publicly for decades afterward, into the 21st century, that there had been an argument about the debt, and that Stilts was the one who produced the gun, and that the struggle was over the gun, and that the clock came down on Stilts' head during that struggle. The shot that went off accidentally sent a fragment into him, and after that, he said Carl Switzer said they should go, and they went. Switzer and Piet were on their way out of the house, heading for the door, when Bud Stilts fired the shot that killed him. And on the knife, Corrigan was flat. There was no knife. Switzer never drew anything, never threatened anyone with a blade. What was found near the body afterward was a penknife, closed, the kind of thing that falls out of a man's pocket when he goes down. A penknife folded shut on the floor. Tom Corrigan was never called to testify at the coroner's inquest. The one person in that house who was not a participant in the fight, the boy who had been hit by a fragment of the first bullet, was not asked to speak at the proceeding that determined whether a killing had occurred. The inquest accepted Bud Stilts' account. The death was ruled justifiable homicide. No charge was brought. No trial was held. Was ruled justifiable homicide. No charge was brought. No trial was held. Stilts walked out of it and lived the rest of his life, and people have been picking at the contradictions in his testimony ever since, including the awkward fact that he had a prior conviction for perjury on his record, which is to say a formal finding by a court that he had lied under oath. None of that has ever been enough to reopen anything. It probably never will be. The paperwork is closed, and everyone who was in that room is gone. There is one more thing about that day, and it is the detail that turned Carl Switzer from a news story into folklore. On the morning of the 21st of January, 1959, hours before Switzer drove out to Mission Hills, Cecil B. DeMille died in Los Angeles at the age of 77. DeMille, the man who essentially invented the idea of the Hollywood picture as an event. His death took every column inch in every paper in the country. The next morning, the story of a former child star shot to death over a $50 dog debt in a house in the valley ran, where it ran at all, as a paragraph. And the two of them had worked together. 3 years earlier, Carl Switzer had taken an uncredited day as a Hebrew slave in the Ten Commandments, standing in the background of a DeMille crowd for a day's pay. And now they had died within hours of each other, and one of them got the front page, and the other got a filler item. And eventually they were buried at the same cemetery in Hollywood, a short walk apart. That is the moment the curse story got its engine. Not because anyone said the word yet, because the death was strange enough and small enough, and unjust enough that it stuck in people's throats, and because the wire services carried just enough of it, and because right around the same stretch, there was a garbled report about another death wrongly attached to the series, and the two things together put an idea into the air that would take another 4 decades to grow a name. But the Switzer family was not finished. Harold, the older brother, Slim Deadpan, the one who played the mandolin in Beginner's Luck, and then watched his little brother become one of the most famous children in the world, while he stood in the back of the shot. he never got a real character, and he never got another credit outside the series. And when it ended, he did not chase it. He went and got a life instead. He operated a franchise for the Speed Queen Company, installing and servicing washing machines and dryers, married, had children, and by the middle of the 1960s, he was a 40-year-old appliance man in Southern California. On the 14th of April, 1967, Harold Switzer got into a dispute with a customer, and he killed him. And then he drove out to a remote spot outside the city and took his own life. He was 42. He is buried at Hollywood forever. Their father is beside him. Carl is on the other side of their father, two brothers from Paris, Illinois, who used to sing at county fairs to help pay the bills, laid down 8 years apart on either side of the man who used to drive them there. That is the case at its strongest. If you want to believe something followed these children, that family is the place to make your stand, because two brothers dying violently in a decade over money and a quarrel is a great deal to swallow as coincidence. Sit with it, though, and look at what is actually in front of you. A man with a job, a mortgage, and a temper, in a country where the leading cause of death for men his age was already the things men his age did to each other. Harold Switzer had not been in a movie in 27 years. Whatever was inside him in that customer's house had nothing to do with a mandolin in 1935. And the next one is the one that comes closest to looking like something, because when they found him, nobody could say what had killed him, not even the coroner. Of all of them, the one with the most talent was the one who got out. That is what makes Scotty Beckett so hard to place. Every explanation you can build for what happened to these children runs into him and stops. He was not trapped by the character. He escaped the character almost immediately. He had a real career, a large one, working with the best people in the business for 15 straight years, and it did not save him at all. He was born in Oakland in the autumn of 1929, 3 weeks before the market fell. When he was about 3, the family moved down to Los Angeles because his father needed medical treatment. And that is the detail that explains the rest of him, because Scotty spent a piece of his early childhood in a hospital, not as a patient, as a visitor coming in to see his father in the wards at Cedars of Lebanon. And what a small boy does in a hospital corridor when nobody knows what to say is he performs. He sang for the patients. He went bed to bed and sang for 6 strangers, and they lit up. And somebody in the film business happened to be there and heard him. That is the origin. A 3-year-old learned that when the adults are frightened and the room is heavy, you sing, and the room gets better. He learned it in a hospital next to his dying father, and it worked. And it got him a screen test. His father died right around the time those first pictures came out. Scotty Beckett was 4 years old and a professional actor. He debuted in Gallant Lady, opposite Anne Harding, alongside another small boy named Dickie Moore, who would also end up in our gang. And in 1934, Hal Roach signed him to a multi-year contract and put him in the gang as Spanky McFarlane's best friend. They dressed him in a look you would know instantly, a baseball cap on crooked or turned all the way around, and a sweater several sizes too big that kept sliding off one shoulder no matter what he did. That was Scotty. Small, quick, conspiratorial, always half a step behind Spanky, and usually the one who suggested the bad idea. He is in High Neighbor and For Pete's Sake, and the first roundup, and Honky Donkey and Mama's Little Pirate. And if you have seen the Sound era shorts, you have loved him without knowing his name. He was only a regular for about 1.5 years, and then he did the thing none of the others could do. He left and he got bigger. Hollywood in the middle 1930s had a specific and constant need. Every picture about a great man required a boy to play the great man as a child, and every picture about a leading lady required a son. And there was real money in being the right kid for that job. Scotty Beckett became the best in town at it. He played the young Anthony in Anthony Adverse in 1936. He was in Dante's Inferno with Spencer Tracy. He was in the charge of the Light Brigade. In 1938, he played the Dauphin in Marie Antoinette, which is to say he played the doomed child of the King and Queen of France in one of the largest productions MGM mounted that decade. He was Tim in My Favorite Wife with Cary Grant and Irene Dunne in 1940. He was the young Paris Mitchell in Kings Row in 1942. The picture Ronald Reagan spent the rest of his life being asked about. He played the young Ali Baba. He was in Heaven Can Wait and The Blue Bird and Battleground and A Date with Judy, where he is Oogie Pringle opposite Jane Powell. And in 1946, he played the young Al Jolson in The Jolson Story, which was one of the biggest pictures of the year. The singing dubbed by another boy because by then Scotty's voice had changed. And that is a strange thing to think about. A former child singer whose singing had to be replaced by a child. That is not a survivor of a childhood series. That is a career. He worked at MGM as a teenager, went to Los Angeles High School, started at the University of Southern California, and dropped out because you cannot go to college and be an actor at the same time, and something has to give. He was in his early 20s when the phone slowed down. It is the oldest problem in the business, and it has nothing to do with talent. The boy who plays the hero as a child is competing, at 22, against every other handsome young man in Los Angeles. And the thing that made him valuable, being small, is gone. He got one real chance at a second act. In 1954, he was cast as Winky, the comic sidekick on a children's science fiction show called Rocky Jones, Space Ranger. Steady work, a regular part, a whole new audience of kids who had never heard of our gang. He was fired almost immediately after 2 arrests, one for carrying a concealed weapon, one for passing a bad check. They recast him. The actor who took over the part, Jimmy Lidon, had known Beckett for years, and years later he talked about it without cruelty, and without much softening either. Scotty drank heavily. Scotty gambled. Scotty borrowed money from people and did not give it back. In a town where everyone knows everyone, that is a reputation, and a reputation like that closes doors faster than any amount of bad luck. The last credited film work is around 1956 and 1957. He was 27 years old, and he had been working since he was 4, and it was finished. The rest is a slide with a lot of specific dates on it. He had been picked up on suspicion of drunk driving as far back as 1948, when he was 18. He married a professional tennis player named Beverly Baker in 1949, and it was over the next year. He married an actress named Sunny Vickers in 1951, and they had a son and divorced in 1957. In the early part of that year, he was arrested near the Mexican border with roughly 250 stimulant tablets on him. 4 days later, he put his car into a tree in West Los Angeles. 4 days, he broke his hip and fractured his skull. He came out of that crash a physically damaged man, on crutches, sometimes in a chair, and whatever thin chance remained of a screen career ended in that wreck, because the business has no place at all for a leading man in his late 20s, who cannot walk across a room without help. More arrests came in 1959. In 1962, after a long stretch of heavy drinking, he tried to end his own life and did not succeed. There were still people who loved him. He married Margaret Sabo in 1961, and she stayed with him to the end, which was 6 more years. He sold real estate for a while, and cars for a while when he could manage it. Twice he went back and tried to enroll at a university with the idea, and this is the part that catches in your chest, of studying medicine. A man in his 30s on crutches, who had been famous since before he could read, sitting in an admissions office trying to explain that he would like to become a doctor. It did not happen. It was never going to happen, but he tried it twice. On the 8th of May, 1968, Scotty Beckett checked himself into a nursing home in Los Angeles. He was seeking treatment for injuries from a beating. Someone had badly hurt him, and the circumstances of that were never established, not then and not since. Nobody knows who did it. Nobody knows why. 2 days later, on the 10th of May, they found him dead in his room. He was 38 years old. There were pills in the room. There was a note. An autopsy was performed, and the Los Angeles County coroner did something unusual with it. He declined to name a cause. Undetermined. That is what the record says, and that is what it still says. Most accounts written since have treated it as an overdose and as a suicide. His third attempt, and that is probably right, and there is a note, and the note is hard to argue with. Some accounts point to the beating, and to years of damage from alcohol. What is actually established is only this. He was hurt by someone. He went somewhere for help. 2 days later, he was gone, and the county could not say from what. He is buried at the San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills, which is the same corner of the valley where Carl Switzer had bled to death 9 years earlier over a dog. Two of the most recognizable children in America, finishing within a few miles of each other, in a part of Los Angeles nobody thinks about. That is the one that comes closest. If you were building a case that something was hunting these people, Scotty Beckett is your best exhibit, because the story has an unsolved beating in it, and a coroner who would not sign off, and a man who had every advantage the others did not have, and was destroyed anyway. And the answer is still no, because you can trace every step of it, and none of the steps require anything mysterious. A 4-year-old learns that performing keeps the adults from falling apart. His father dies. He works for 15 years. The work stops, as it stops for everybody, and there is nothing under it, because he left school to do it. He starts drinking, he starts gambling, he gets arrested and gets fired, and gets in a car and hits a tree, and after that his body will not carry him anymore. That is not a curse. That is a very specific injury, done to a very small child by a very ordinary industry, taking 34 years to finish its work. The next one is a woman, and the world would not let her be one. Every boy in America was in love with her, and that turned out to be a life sentence. Darla Hood came from a small town in western Oklahoma, born in the autumn of 1931, and she arrived on the Roach lot as a very small girl with dark hair and a bow, and an air of complete self-possession. She was the sweetheart. That was the job. In a series built out of scrappy boys and homemade contraptions, she was the one thing they all wanted and could not have. And the entire romantic architecture of the Sound era shorts was built on her, with Alfalfa serenading her badly, and Spanky rolling his eyes, and Waldo showing up in a press suit to be the rich rival. She made her last one, Wedding Worries, in 1941. She was 10 years old, and here is the thing about Darla Hood that separates her from most of this story. She did not disappear, she did not fall apart, and she did not spend her life bitter. She went right on working. She had a career, a real one, for 35 more years, and almost nobody noticed, because the country had already decided who she was, and was not accepting revisions. She went to Fairfax High School in Los Angeles, and put together a vocal group, with some of the boys called the Enchanters, and they were good enough to get hired to sing the music you hear behind other people in movies, and good enough to get booked into Ken Murray's Blackouts, the enormous long-running variety show that played Hollywood and New York. Then she went solo, and this is where it gets interesting. Her adult singing voice was nothing like the voice people remembered. The child voice had been high and thin and sweet, the sound of a little girl in a bow. The woman's voice was low and warm and full, a proper nightclub instrument, and she used it in proper nightclubs. The Coconut Grove in Los Angeles, the Copacabana in New York, the Sahara in Las Vegas. Those are not small rooms, those are the rooms. She was a regular on the Ken Murray show at the start of the 1950s. Around the middle of the decade, she worked as the leading lady in Edgar Bergen's act, which meant standing next to one of the most famous men in American entertainment and holding an audience. She was a regular performer on the Merv Griffin Show in 1957. She sat with Groucho Marx on You Bet Your Life. She cut singles for small labels at the end of the decade, including one called My Quiet Village, and the picture on that record sleeve is supposedly what got her the only significant adult film role she ever had. That role came in 1959 in a horror picture called The Bat, where she plays a secretary named Judy Hollander opposite Vincent Price and Agnes Moorehead. Watch it now, and you will see a poised, dark-eyed young woman in her 20s who is entirely competent and entirely anonymous, and unless somebody tells you, you will not connect her to anything. That was it. That was the whole adult film career. One picture. So she did what working performers do. She went where the work was, which by the 1960s meant your voice more than your face. She dubbed the English language princess in an animated feature. She did commercials, she did jingles. If you were an American with a television in that decade, you heard Darla Hood sell you soup, and you heard her sell you canned tuna, and there is a good chance the mermaid in the tuna advertisements that ran for years was her. She married twice. Her second husband was a record company executive named Jose Granson, and they were together from 1957 until she died, and they had 3 children. It was not an easy marriage in the later years. Granson had a stroke and ended up in a wheelchair, and Tommy Bond, who had played Butch the Bully and who stayed in touch with everybody, said afterward that things had gotten hard in that house. And then there is the part that tells you exactly what she was carrying. Fans met her. All her life fans met her. Grown men who had been boys in front of a television set, who had loved her the way you love the first face that ever affected you, would come up to a woman in her 30s and 40s and be visibly, openly disappointed because she was not the little girl. She was never going to be the little girl. She was a working singer with 3 children and a husband in a wheelchair, and she stood there while people looked at her and grieved for someone she used to be. She knew she talked about it. She was aware of the whole mechanism, and she was gracious about it anyway, which is a harder thing than it sounds. And rather than resent the series, she went the other direction. She became its champion. She pushed to get our gang recognized by the Sons of the Desert, the Laurel and Hardy Appreciation Society, which was the closest thing that world had to an institution. She wrote letters, and she made calls, and she showed up. In 1979, she was organizing a Little Rascals reunion for the Los Angeles chapter, scheduled for the following year, getting the surviving cast into one room for the first time in decades. One more detail before the end, and it is the one that will stay with you. Among the last jobs she ever took was voice work on an animated Little Rascals Christmas special in 1979. She played the mother, Spanky's mother, the mother of the boy she had been 6 years old with, the girl they had all been in love with 40 years on, doing the voice of the woman who calls them in for dinner. That June, she went into Canoga Park Hospital for an appendectomy. Routine, the most ordinary operation there is. She was 47 years old, and there is nothing in the record to suggest she was a sick woman before she walked in. Somewhere in that procedure, she was given a blood transfusion, and the blood was contaminated, and it carried hepatitis. In 1979, nobody in that building had any way of knowing. The specific virus that most likely killed her had not even been identified yet, and would not be for another decade, and the screening that would have caught it did not exist. She got hepatitis from the transfusion, and her heart failed, and on the 13th of June, 1979, Darla Hood died in North Hollywood, 47 years old, killed by a bag of blood in a routine surgery, while planning a reunion for the people she grew up with. They buried her 5 days later. About 150 people came. Matthew Beard was there, the boy they had called Stymie in his derby hat. Mickey Laughlin came. Luso Prin came, who was Hal Roach's wife. She lies at Hollywood forever, not far from Carl Switzer, not far from Cecil B. DeMille. Billy Thomas, whom the world knew as Buckwheat, heard the news and said publicly how badly it had shaken him. He had about 16 months left himself. Her name has been on every version of the curse list for 45 years, and you can see why. 47 is young, and an appendectomy is nothing, and there is something about dying from the treatment rather than the illness that makes the mind reach for a pattern. But look at what actually killed her: an unscreened blood supply. In 1979, before the tests existed, thousands of people in this country were infected by transfusions every year, and most of them were not in the movies, and nearly all of them are forgot. Darla Hood died of the ordinary state of American medicine in the year she happened to need it. The reunion went ahead the following year without her, and at that reunion, something happened to one of the men in the room. That is one of the few genuinely lovely moments in this entire story, and it happened 10 weeks before he died. He is the most recognizable face in the entire series, and the least known man in it, and both of those facts were his own doing. Billy Thomas was born in Los Angeles in 1931, and he was on the Roach lot before he was 4. He played Buckwheat for a decade, in something around 90 of the shorts, which is a longer run than almost anyone managed. He is the only performer who was there under Hal Roach, and still there at the very end under MGM in 1944, which means that if you watch the whole series in order, from the middle of the 1930s to the last frame, there is exactly one child who is present through all of it, growing up in front of you, while everyone else arrives and leaves around him. He was 12 or 13 when it stopped, And then Billy Thomas did something almost nobody in this story did. He looked at the business that had employed him since he was a toddler, and he thought about it, and he decided he wanted no part of it. Not right away. It took a decade and a uniform. In 1954, at 23, he enlisted in the United States Army. This was after Korea, in the cold years that followed, and he served 2 years and came out with the National Defense Service Medal and the Good Conduct Medal, and by every account, he took to Army life without difficulty. There is a small error carved on his grave marker, which lists him as a veteran of the Second World War, when he was a child during that war, and served 10 years after it. And it is the kind of mistake that gets made once in stone, and then stands forever. When he came home, the offers were waiting, film and stage both. There was still money in the name. He turned them all down. He explained it later, and the explanation is one of the clearest pieces of thinking anyone connected to this series ever produced. He did not want the hassle of performing. He looked at the profession, and he called it a rat race with no security. And he pointed out the thing that everyone in show business knows, and almost nobody says out loud, which is that even the big ones, even the established stars, spend their whole lives auditioning. There is no seniority. There is no pension. You are only as employed as your last job, forever. At 50, as much as at 15, he had spent his entire childhood inside that machine. He knew exactly what it paid and exactly what it cost. So he stayed in the film industry and got out of the movie business, which are two different things. He trained as an editor and a cutter, and he went to work in a laboratory, Technicolor first, then Metricolor. He spent decades in the lab, processing negative, doing the invisible technical work that stands between a camera and a screen. And he was good at it, and he kept the job, and it kept him. Some of the film that went through his hands in those years belonged to pictures the whole country went out to see. He worked on the negative for Jaws. He worked on Logan's Run in the summer of 1975, when America lost its mind over a shark. Part of the reason that picture looked the way it looked in a theater in your town is that a former child star handled the film in a Los Angeles lab and knew what he was doing. No poverty, no collapse, no sad third act in a rented room. He chose security deliberately with his eyes open, and he got it. And he raised a son who went to California State University at Northridge. Now, all of that has to sit alongside the other thing, because the other thing is real, and this audience knows it. Buckwheat is a hard character to look at now, and it is worth being straight about why. When the character first appeared, it was as a girl, in the old costume vocabulary of American racial caricature, the pigtails and the oversized clothes, and the dialect was written in. Later, the character became a boy with a wild, uncombed look that was also borrowed from a very old and very ugly visual tradition. Those things are in those films. They cannot be edited out of history. And by the 1950s and 1960s, the NAACP was pressing hard enough that the syndication package was cut to remove the worst of it. And at the same time, and this is the part that makes it complicated, our gang was doing something in the 1920s and 1930s that essentially nothing else in mainstream American film was doing. Black children and white children on screen together, in the same neighborhood, in the same schoolroom, in the same fights, as equals and as friends. During the height of legal segregation, Ernie Morrison had been the first black actor signed to a long-term Hollywood contract. Alan Hoskins, playing Farina, became one of the most popular child performers in the country in the 1920s of any color and one of the best paid. Southern exhibitors complained about how prominent the black children were. Roach kept making them anyway because they sold. The men who were actually in it as adults were asked about this over and over for the rest of their lives. Morrison, Beard, Thomas, and they defended it consistently, and their argument was always the same. Every child in that gang was a type. The fat one, the freckled one, the pretty one, the bully, the sissy in the good clothes. Nobody escaped being reduced to one thing. And on that lot, in that schoolroom, at that lunch table, the kids were simply kids together, which was more than the country outside the gate was willing to allow. Both things are true at once. That is usually how history works, and it is why the historian Julia Lee could write an entire book about the racial life of these films and come out the other side without a simple verdict. Which brings us to the summer of 1980 and the best 10 weeks of Billy Thomas's adult life. The Sons of the Desert held their convention at the Los Angeles Hilton in the last days of July and the first days of August. They called it Hollywood 80. More than 500 people came, the sort of people who keep the flame for old comedy, who know every short and every crew credit and every release date. And they brought out the surviving members of our gang and introduced them. When they got to Billy Thomas, 500 people stood up. Nobody planned it. There was no cue. A room full of grown adults got to their feet for a 49-year-old man who worked in a film laboratory, who had not performed for anybody in 36 years, who had spent his entire adult life declining to be buckwheat, and they stood there and applauded him. He cried. He stood in front of them and he could not stop the tears. And there are people who were in that room who have talked about it ever since. 10 weeks later, on the 10th of October, 1980, Billy Thomas had a heart attack at his home in Los Angeles and died. He was 49. He is buried at Inglewood Park. And then, a few months after his death, the strangest thing in this entire story happened to him, and he was not alive to say a word about it. In 1981, Eddie Murphy started doing buckwheat on Saturday Night Live. Not the child. An adult buckwheat still speaking in the same garbled dialect, still saying ate, and it was one of the most popular things on American television. Millions of people who had never seen a single frame of our gang learned the name that way. Spanky McFarlane was furious about it, publicly and for years. He said it was a bad imitation of something Billy Thomas had never actually been, and that it was hurting a family that could not fight back. It got worse. In 1990, the news program 2020 ran a segment featuring a man claiming to be the adult buckwheat, alive and working somewhere, and it was completely false. The whole thing came apart. There was an on-air correction. A producer left the network, and Billy Thomas's son sued. That is the afterlife of a man who wanted to be left alone, 12 years dead, and being impersonated on national television by a stranger, while a comedian's parody rewrote his name for a generation. In 1992, his son established a scholarship at Cal State Northridge in his father's name. That is the only monument he has, and given who he was, it is probably the right one. The next man walked further down than any of them, and then walked all the way back. One of them went all the way down, further than Scotty Beckett, further than anyone. Heroin, prison, years of it, the full descent with nothing held back. And then he came back up, and he lived another 15 years, and he spent them telling anyone who asked that Hollywood was not what had done it to him. Matthew Beard was born in Los Angeles on New Year's Day of 1925, the son of a minister, and he came onto the Roach lot as a very small boy at the start of the 1930s. The studio story about his name is that he was constantly underfoot, wandering into shots and stopping takes, and that Robert McGowan said the child was stymieing him, and it stuck the way those things stuck. They put a derby hat on him, a grown man's bowler several sizes too big, sitting down on his ears. The story that got passed around the lot was that Stan Laurel had given it to him, and whether or not that is exactly how it happened, that hat became the single most identifiable object in the whole series. He wore it for 5 years. He was buried in it. He was a wonderful little actor, not a mascot, not a prop. He had timing you cannot teach, and a completely unbothered screen presence, the kind of small performer who makes the adults around him look like they are trying too hard. And he was working in the middle of the Jim Crow era, in a series where he was on absolutely equal footing with the white children, which is why black audiences of that time embraced those pictures in a way that later generations sometimes find surprising. They let him go in 1935. He was 10 years old, and by the arithmetic of that lot, 10 was old. He worked for another decade, small parts, mostly uncredited in real pictures. He is in Captain Blood and The Littlest Rebel in 1935. He is in Jezebel in 1938 as a boy called T-Bat. He is most the bellboy in The Return of Frank James in 1940. He is in Stormy Weather in 1943. He also worked in the independent pictures made by and for black audiences, the ones that played the theaters Hollywood did not serve. In films like Two Gun Man from Harlem and Broken Strings, those are the roles that existed for a young black actor in Los Angeles between 1935 and 1945. And he took them, and then even those stopped. He was a teenager in a Los Angeles neighborhood he later described plainly, in terms of what was on the street and what it wanted from a boy with time on his hands. He dropped out in the 11th grade. He was smoking marijuana at 16. At 18, he was arrested for stealing, and he was stealing to pay for the habit, then heroin. And that was the next 20 years of his life. In and out of jail, on drug charges and theft charges, over and over, through the whole of the 1950s and into the middle of the 1960s. The child in the derby hat, the boy that millions of Americans were watching every afternoon on television by then, was a heroin addict cycling through the county system in the same city where the films were being broadcast. He would have died there. Almost everybody in that condition, in those years with those resources, died there. Around 1966, he went into Synanon. Synanon was a residential drug rehabilitation community in California, and its history is complicated, and in its later years genuinely dark, and it ended up drawing serious criticism for turning into something like a cult. All of that is true. It is also true that in 1966, there was virtually nothing else. Addiction was treated as a criminal matter and a moral failure, and if you were a black man with a record and a needle habit, the options available to you were a cell or the street. He went in intending to stay a little while. He stayed 7 years. He got clean, he stayed clean. He worked his way up inside the place and ended up running the transportation department, driving the big buses between facilities, responsible for schedules and vehicles and other people. He got his life back one ordinary duty at a time, and he got his father back, the minister, whatever had broken between them across 20 years of arrests and disappearances, got repaired inside that community. And Matthew Beard said for the rest of his life that the program had saved him, and he meant it literally because it had. Then, at nearly 50 years old, with a criminal record and a 2-decade hole in his resume, he went back to work as an actor. That should not have been possible. It happened anyway, because television in the 1970s finally had places for a black character man with a real face and 40 years of living in it. He did 3 episodes of Sanford and Son as a man named Otis Littlejohn. He had a recurring part on Good Times as Monty across several seasons. He turned up on Maude and The Jeffersons and Emergency and Starsky and Hutch and Different Strokes. He was in Truck Turner in 1974, and in 1978, he appeared in the Buddy Holly story, playing one of the backstage crew at the Apollo Theater, and he wore the derby, 53 years old, in a hit picture in the hat. He went to the reunions, he showed up for the fan events, and sat with Spanky McFarland and signed things for people. In June of 1979, he was at Darla Hood's funeral, one of about 150 people in the room, wearing the hat, saying goodbye to a woman he had been 6 years old with. And every time somebody asked him the question, and they asked him constantly, he gave the same answer. He did not blame the movies. He did not blame Hal Roach or the studio, or being famous at 6, or being finished at 10. He blamed the street he was standing on at 16. He said it in interviews, and he said it in lectures on drug abuse that he gave for years afterward, standing in front of rooms full of young people, telling them precisely what it had cost him and exactly where he thought it had started. Take that seriously. Of every person in this story, Matthew Beard had the strongest possible claim to blame Hollywood, and he had the credibility to make it stick, and he refused. He said it was the neighborhood and the drug and his own choices, and he told the truth as he understood it, even when a different answer would have made a better headline. On the 3rd of January, 1981, 2 days after his 56th birthday, he had a stroke and fell down a flight of stairs and injured his head. He died of pneumonia 5 days later, on the 8th of January, in Los Angeles. They buried him at Evergreen Cemetery, on the east side, in the derby hat. 56 years old. On any list of the cursed, he is a headline entry. Child star heroin prison, dead before 60. Read it the way he read it, and it is one of the more decent stories in 20th century American life. A man went down as far as a person can go and climbed out with his own hands and got 15 good years and a career and his father back. And then his body gave out at an age when a lot of men's bodies gave out in 1981. He was 56. Darla was 47. Billy Thomas was 49. All three of them died within about 18 months of each other, between the summer of 1979 and the winter of 1981, and they had all been in the same room at that reunion. That is the cluster people point at. Three of the best-known faces in the series, gone in a year and a half, in their 40s and 50s. If a curse were ever going to look real, it would look like that. And still, when you set them side by side, you have a contaminated transfusion, a heart attack, and a stroke. Three ordinary causes of death in a country where the ordinary causes of death were killing people at those ages every single day of that decade. There is one more death still to come, and it is the strangest of the lot, and it happened to a man who was 87 years old. Before any of the famous ones, before Spanky and Alfalfa and Darla, before there was even sound, there was a boy with more freckles on his face than anyone had ever seen, and a laugh that sounded like a door coming off its hinges. Mickey Daniels was there at the start. He was one of the original leads in 1922, one of the children Hal Roach picked up through friends and studio connections in the first weeks, and he carried those silent shorts through the middle of the decade with Mary Cornman beside him. If you go back to the beginning of the whole thing, to the very first films, his is one of the faces looking back at you. When he aged out, he did what a working performer did in 1927. He went into vaudeville. He came back for the boyfriend's shorts with Mary Cornman, which were essentially Our Gang Grown Up, an attempt by the studio to keep the same audience as the same kids got taller. He picked up bit parts in pictures into the 1940s and even into the early 1950s. He came back for the occasional adult cameo in the series he had helped start, which is a strange thing to do, standing on the same lot in the same doorway 15 years later as a grown man in the background. Then he left it. He went into construction engineering and did well enough at it to work overseas, which is a long way from a comedy lot in Culver City, and by every appearance a deliberate one. By 1967, he was driving a taxi in San Diego for an outfit called Red Top. The drinking had him by then. It had probably had him a long time. He was a chronic alcoholic in the clinical sense, and on the 20th of August, 1970, Mickey Daniels was found dead in a transient hotel in San Diego. His liver had failed. He was 55. The saddest detail is the paperwork. It took a while to establish who he was, and then it took a while for anyone to come and claim him. The first star of the longest-running comedy series in American film history lay in a county facility in San Diego, while somebody worked out whose body it was. He is at Forest Lawn in Glendale now. Somebody eventually came. That is 1970, and after that the list goes quiet for a long stretch. And then in a single year it produced 2 deaths so strange that they finally forced the country to sit up and start counting. The year was 2002. In May of that year, a man was walking down a street in Riverside, California. He was 72 years old, retired, and he had spent much of his adult life in ministry, doing the kind of work that does not get written up anywhere, counseling people and running programs, and showing up for families on the worst days of their lives. His name was Darwood Kay, and 65 years earlier he had been Waldo. If you know the shorts, you know Waldo immediately. The rich kid, the one in the pressed suit and the neat part in his hair, who turns up to compete with Alfalfa for Darla's attention, and who is insufferable about it. The walking argument for everything the gang stood against. He was the snob, and he was very good at being the snob, and he did it in a run of shorts in the late 1930s, when the series was at its most popular. And then he grew up and went into the ministry, and spent his life on other people. There is something quietly funny about that, the little aristocrat becoming the servant, and he seems to have thought so too. On the 15th of May, 2002, walking in Riverside, Darwood Kay was struck by a car. The driver did not stop. Hit and run, 72 years old. 5 months later, at the other end of the age range and at the other end of the series, the last one happened. J.R. Smith was one of the silent boys. He came in around 1925 and made something like 36 of them into the early sound era. And he was hired, like Mickey Daniels before him, for Freckles. They called him Specs. They also called him Turkey Egg, which tells you the general standard of nicknaming on that lot. He got very little out of the talkies and left the business more or less immediately. And then he went and had the kind of life the curse lists have no idea what to do with. He joined the Navy in the Second World War and served in the Pacific, including at Guam. He came home and opened a retail paint business and ran it. He lived in Hawaii for years. In the early 1990s, in his late 70s, he moved to Las Vegas. He was 87 years old in the autumn of 2002. He had survived the Depression, the war, the Pacific, the entire 20th century. He had outlived nearly everyone in this story, and he had befriended a homeless man. That is the detail that everything turns on, and it is the detail that makes it unbearable. An old man in Las Vegas with time on his hands was kind to somebody who had nothing. In October of 2002, he was reported missing. They found his body in the desert outside the city. The coroner determined that he had been stabbed repeatedly and beaten. A man named Charles Wayne Crombie, then in his 50s, was convicted of the murder. He had also taken Smith's belongings, his debit card and his vehicle, and he was convicted of those things too. He received consecutive life sentences, and he died in prison in 2014, 87 years old, killed for a car and a card by a man he had shown kindness to. There is no possible reading of that as the consequence of a comedy short filmed in 1927. He was 87. He had been out of the movies for 73 years. The thing that killed J.R. Smith was the specific and ancient danger of being an elderly person with something to steal. And it happens in this country every week to people whose names never appear in an article about anything. But the timing, look at what that year produced. In May, Waldo is killed by a hit-and-run driver in Riverside. In October, Specs is found stabbed to death in the desert outside Las Vegas. 2 former gang players, murdered or killed by strangers, 5 months apart, 58 years after the series ended. And in between those 2 deaths, in the same year, in the same city, the most famous surviving member of the gang was arrested for murder. That is the year the curse was born. Not 1936, when Norman Chaney died in Baltimore. Not 1959, when Carl Switzer bled to death over a dog. 2002, in a year when 3 separate stories collided and a television network noticed. His name was Michael Gubitosi before it was anything else, and by his own account, he had the worst childhood of any of them. He said it for decades, in interviews on television, to anyone who asked. A violent house, parents who hit him and who put him to work as a very small child, because the family needed what a small child could earn. Whatever the exact accounting, it was not a happy home, and he never pretended it was, and it shaped every single thing he became. He came into our gang around 1939, billed at first under his real name and then as Bobby Blake, playing a character called Mickey, and he made something like 40 of them. When Spanky McFarlane left, Blake moved up into the lead, which means the last few years of the longest-running comedy series in American film belonged to him. He was there at the end, in 1944, when they shut it down. And unlike almost every other name in this story, he kept going. All the way, he played Little Beaver in the Red Ryder Westerns as a boy. He worked as a young man, and then he did the thing that put him in the front rank, which was in Cold Blood in 1967, playing Perry Smith, one of the 2 men who murdered the Clutter family in Kansas. It is one of the coldest and best performances of that decade, and it came out of a former child comedian, and everyone who saw it understood that something unusual had just happened. Then Beretta in the 1970s, a hit series and an Emmy. He was, for a stretch, one of the most recognizable actors in America for the second time in one life. In 2001, his second wife, Bonnie Lee Backley, was shot and killed while sitting in his car outside Vitalo's, a restaurant in Studio City where they had just had dinner. Blake said he had gone back inside to retrieve a handgun he had left at the table. He was arrested in the spring of 2002 and charged with her murder and with soliciting others to commit it. He went to trial in 2005 and he was acquitted. The jury was not persuaded. Afterward, a civil jury in a separate proceeding found him liable for her wrongful death and ordered him to pay something close to $30 million to her children. He died of heart disease in March of 2023 at the age of 89, which makes him one of the longest-lived people in this entire story. Now here is why he matters to the curse, which has almost nothing to do with whether he did it. When Robert Blake was arrested in the spring of 2002, every entertainment desk in America went into the archives. They needed background. They needed to explain who this man was to a generation that knew Beretta at best. So they pulled the old material, and the old material said Our Gang. And once you are inside the Our Gang file, you start noticing something. The file has a lot of dead children in it, and it was the perfect year to notice. Because in the same 12 months, Waldo was killed by a hit-and-run driver in Riverside, and Specs was found stabbed in the desert outside Las Vegas, and the man who took over the gang after Spanky was sitting in a Los Angeles jail charged with shooting his wife. Somebody at a cable network did the arithmetic and saw a program in it. On the 24th of November 2002, True Hollywood Story broadcast an episode called Curse of the Little Rascals. That is the birth certificate. That is where the phrase enters the language. It had been floating in fragments for years, in fan letters and trivia paperbacks, and the odd magazine sidebar. But that broadcast is what put a name on it and pushed it into millions of houses at once. It went through the lives, Switzer and Beckett and Cheney and Laughlin and the rest, laid the deaths end to end, and framed the pile as a pattern that wanted explaining. Everything since has been a copy of a copy. Websites and podcasts and message boards and social media compilations, all recirculating the same list in the same order. All of it with a photograph of laughing children at the top and a run of death dates underneath. And every version does the same three things. It always picks the dramatic ones and leaves out the boring ones. And boring in this context means alive at 80. It stretches. It adds people who barely appeared, one-day players and background children. And in some versions, a dog. Because the story about the first Pete the pup being poisoned is too good to leave out, even though several different dogs played that part over the years. And it never, not once, tells you how many children were in the series. That last one is the whole trick. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A list of 10 tragedies feels like a haunting. A list of 10 tragedies out of how many is a statistic. So the number never appears. The number is where we go now. And the first person to say it out loud said it in 1973. And he was the man who had started all of it. Hal Roach lived to be 100 years old. Sit with that for a second, because it is the single most inconvenient fact in the entire curse story. The man who put every one of these children in front of a camera, who signed the contracts and set the wages and decided when each of them was finished, outlived nearly all of them. He was born in 1892, and he died in 1992. And in that century, he buried Chubby Cheney and Weezer Hutchins and Froggy Laughlin and Bonedust Young, and Alfalfa Switzer, and Harold Switzer and Mickey Daniels, and Scotty Beckett and Darla Hood, and Billy Thomas and Matthew Beard. And he was still walking around Los Angeles afterward, and he attended an Academy Awards ceremony in 1984 to accept an honorary Oscar, handed to him by 2 of his own former children. If something was hunting those kids, it walked right past the man who hired them. He was asked about it in 1973, long before anyone had invented the phrase. He had seen enough of them go by then to know exactly what people were driving at, and his answer was flat and unsentimental and correct. Some of them got into trouble, he said. Some of them had bad luck. Those were the ones who made the headlines. And then he gave the number, which is the part that matters, and the part that every article written since has managed to leave out. He said that if you took 176 other children and followed them through their entire lives, you would find the same percentage having trouble later on. 176. That is roughly how many children passed through those 221 shorts across 22 years. Not 10, not the dozen on the list. 176 children, most of them appearing for a season or two and going home, born between roughly 1910 and 1935, coming of age in the Depression and the war. Follow 176 people through the 20th century, and you are going to bury a lot of them badly. Some in cars, some in uniform, some in hospital beds decades too early, some by their own hand. That is not a haunted comedy series. That is what 176 lives look like. Somebody eventually did the work properly. In 2005, the fact-checking site Snopes went at the claim directly, using Leonard Maltin and Richard Band's book on the series, which remains the serious history of the thing. Along with the film records and the contemporary reporting, they did something smart. Rather than argue about who counts, they took the core group, the 29 children who appeared in 15 or more shorts, the actual regulars, the ones any reasonable person would say were in our gang. And here is what the regulars actually did with their lives. 55% of them were either still living at the time of that analysis, or had made it to at least 72 years old. 76% reached the average life expectancy for people born when they were born. 83% made it to what we would now call middle age, meaning their late 40s and beyond. Now hold that against the other number, the one nobody thinks about. Average life expectancy at birth in the United States for a child born in the 1920s or early 1930s was somewhere in the mid-50s, not 78, mid-50s. That is what these children were statistically issued at birth. All of them, movie star and paperboy alike. 3/4 of the Our Gang regulars beat it. Then add the war. Nearly every boy in that series hit draft age in exactly the wrong decade, and a great many of them served, and 2 of them did not come home. Then add the plain fact that these were largely working class and lower middle class families, not dynasties. The money that came in went to rent and groceries, and a father who could not find work. And when the money stopped, the families were where they had been before. Put all of that together, and the honest verdict is not that our gang was cursed. It is that the regulars did slightly better than their generation, and the ones who did badly in the ordinary ways of their century. And the reason it looks like a pattern is that we have film of every one of them at 7 years old, smiling, and no film at all of the ordinary children who died in the same numbers on the same schedule, with no one watching. That is the whole illusion. We can see their faces. That is the only difference. And now the part the list never runs, because it does not go anywhere. Jackie Cooper was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor at the age of 9 for a picture called Skippy in 1931, and he is still the youngest person ever nominated in that category. And he was in our gang before that. He did not fall apart. He worked his entire life. He acted, and then when acting slowed, he went and became a television director, and won Emmys doing it. And a whole generation, who never saw a frame of his childhood work, knew him as Perry White, shouting at Clark Kent in the Superman pictures. He died in 2011 at 88 years old, with one of the 2 Hollywood Walk of Fame stars ever given to an Our Gang alumnus. Joe Cobb, the original fat kid, the one Chubby Chaney was hired to replace, went into aerospace. The heavy-set child from the silent comedies spent his working life in the American aircraft industry and lived to 85. Sidney Kibrick played Woim, the sidekick to Butch the Bully, the small one hovering at the shoulder of the tough kid. He grew up, went into business, and became one of the last surviving featured players from the whole series. And he died in early 2026 at the age of 97. 97 years old. He was there. He worked on that lot with those children. He remembered the megaphone and the schoolroom and the 16-hour days. And he outlived the rumor's loudest years, and he never had much use for it. Jean Darling lived into her 90s. Jerry Tucker lived a long life. Others went into engineering and business and the technical end of the film industry, and raised families, and had grandchildren, and are not on anybody's list, because a man who sold insurance in Ohio until he was 79 does not make an episode of television. And then there are the 2 the lists leave out most consistently of all, which is a shame, because they came first, and they are the reason the rest of it existed. Ernie Morrison was the original. Everything in this story begins with him. He was born in New Orleans at the end of 1912, and he was already a working film performer before he was 5. And by the time Hal Roach was standing at that window watching children fight over lumber. Morrison was the one asset Roach already had in hand. He was the first black actor signed to a long-term Hollywood contract, and at his height, he was the highest-paid black performer in the business. And he got there before he was 10 years old. Roach had tried to build a solo series around him in 1921 and got refused by theater owners who would not put a black child at the top of a bill. And that refusal is the accident that produced our gang, because the answer was to surround him with other children instead. Every laugh in 220 shorts traces back to a booking department in the American South saying no. He left the series in the mid-1920s and went to New York and worked vaudeville, which is where a performer went when he was genuinely good and needed to eat. He came back to pictures later as the only black member of the East Side Kids. He worked in one form or another into the 1970s, and when they asked him as an old man what he thought of Roach and that lot in that time, he had good things to say consistently for decades, and he was not the kind of man who said things he did not mean. Ernie Morrison died in Linwood, California in the summer of 1989. He was 76 years old. The first child ever hired for the Little Rascals lived longer than almost anyone in this story, and no curse list has ever had a use for him. The other one was smaller still when he started. Alan Hoskins was 14 months old. That is not a figure of speech. He was a baby. He was born in Boston in 1920, and his family came west, and he followed Ernie Morrison into the studio one day, in the way a toddler follows an older boy anywhere. And Hal Roach looked at him and put him on the payroll. They called him Farina, and he stayed 9 years, and he made 105 of them, which is more shorts than any other child in the history of the series. He was the most popular black child performer in America in the 1920s, and he was paid accordingly, several $100s a week at a time. When a grown man with a trade was pleased to see 30, the studio did something to him that is uncomfortable to look at now. For the early years, they deliberately kept his gender ambiguous as a gimmick, dressing him in a shift with his hair in tight pigtails. And they let the audience wonder and argue about it, because arguing about it sold tickets. That was a decision made about a small child by grown men in an office. And it is exactly the kind of thing that got done in 1924, without anyone pausing over it, none of which stopped him from being a wonderful actor. He came through the transition to sound without a scratch, which broke performers 3 times his age, and Roach thought he was the most naturally gifted child on the lot. Fern Carter thought something else about him. She taught in that little schoolroom for 23 years, and by the end she had taught something north of 300 children, and for the rest of her life, she said that Farina was the brightest student she ever had. He was 11 when they let him go, and Matthew Beard walked in to take the part. He did some vaudeville with his sister, who had also been in the pictures. He served in the Second World War, and then he came home and looked honestly at what was left of an acting career. For a black man in his late 20s in post-war America, and he stopped. He put himself through school. He got licensed as a psychiatric technician and spent the rest of his working life in the San Francisco Bay Area with adults and children with disabilities and mental illness, doing the kind of work that leaves no trace in any archive anywhere. A reporter once asked him whether it disappointed him, leaving Hollywood behind. He said he preferred a job that let him eat regularly. That is the single best sentence anybody connected to this series ever said, and it belongs at the front of every discussion of what happened to these children, and it never appears in any of them. In 1975, he was inducted into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame, which is the only real honor the industry ever paid him. Alan Hoskins died of cancer in Oakland on the 26th of July, 1980, 2 weeks short of his 60th birthday. That is the same handful of days in which 500 people at a hotel in Los Angeles rose to their feet for Billy Thomas, and the 2 of them had been the 2 most famous black children in America, 2 generations apart, and only one of them ever got to hear the applause. So no, there was no curse, but something did happen to these children, something real and specific and traceable, and it was done to them on purpose by people who were not being cruel, which somehow makes it worse rather than better. Here it is. Every single one of them was hired for something they could not keep. That is the whole design. Roach did not want actors. He wanted children, and a child is a temporary condition. The freckles fade, the cowlick lies down, the croaking voice settles into a normal one. The tiny boy who is funny because he is tiny turns 11 and is simply a boy. There was never a version of that job you could hold because the qualification was your age, and nobody has ever held onto their age. So they were all fired, every one of them. Not for failing, for growing, which is the one thing a child cannot be asked to stop doing. And when they went with nothing. No residuals, not one of them. Not a penny from the theatrical reissues. Not a penny from the merchandise. And above all, not a penny from 1955, when those shorts went out into television syndication as The Little Rascals and became one of the most heavily played pieces of film in the history of the medium. Every afternoon in every city in America for decades, millions of children learning their names, advertisers paying real money to be next to them, and Carl Switzer tending bar, and Mickey Daniels driving a cab, and Billy Thomas in a film lab handling somebody else's negative, and Spanky McFarland. And we are about to get to Spanky McFarland selling televisions. They also went with no education worth the name. 3 hours a day was the law, and 3 hours a day is what they got. And Fern Carter fought hard for those 3 hours, and they were still 3 hours. And they went with no trade, because a child who is hired for being himself is never taught to do anything. And when the thing he is stops being marketable, there is nothing underneath. The law that might have protected the money arrived in 1939, 17 years into the run, and it arrived because of Jackie Coogan, and even then, a court had to be persuaded to order it. That is the curse. It is not supernatural, and it never was. It is a business model. You take a child at his most valuable moment. You pay his family a fair weekly wage. You use him until his face changes, and then you release him into the world without a skill, without a diploma, without a share of what he made, and you hold the film forever. Then 16 years later, you sell the film again to a country full of new children, and the man who made it is 30 and broke, and nobody calls him. Most of them survived it. That is the honest ending. Most of them got jobs and raised families and lived out an ordinary length of life. But some of them did not, and when you look at which ones did not, it is not random at all. The boy in the beanie is the answer to all of it, and the answer is not the one anybody wants. George McFarland was 3 years old in 1931 when he arrived on the Hal Roach lot, and he was there for 11 years, and he made 95 of them, more than anyone else in the sound era. He was the leader, not the funniest and not the prettiest, but the one the others looked at when they needed to know what to do. And he had that quality at 4 years old, which is not a thing you can arrange. They called him Spanky. He is the most famous child comedian America ever produced. And if you show a photograph of a small boy in a beanie to 100 people over 60 in any English-speaking country, most of them will say the name without hesitating. He said something about those years that is worth quoting exactly, because it is not what you expect. He said he had a ball. He said he made a lot of money. He said he was 8 or 9 years old before it occurred to him that all children were not in the movies. That is a child who was happy. Take him at his word, because he had no reason to lie about it, and he said it consistently for 50 years. The lot was fun. The crew adored him. He had the run of the place and a schoolroom and a paycheck that was keeping his whole family upright in the worst decade this country ever had. And then he said the other thing, the sentence that goes on his headstone if anybody were being honest. He said he would not take $1 million for the experience, and he would not take a penny to do it again. As a child, he said, he had everything he wanted. They had a good life. But when it was over, it was over. When it was over, it was over. That is the entire story of the Little Rascals curse in 8 words, spoken by the person best placed to know. And there is not one syllable of the supernatural in it, because it did end. In 1942, at 14, MGM let him go. The character was a small round boy in a beanie, and he was neither small nor round, nor a boy any longer, and there was nothing else the studio wanted from him. He picked up a couple of tiny parts. He is somewhere in The Woman in the Window in 1944, and that was the finish. He went home to Texas. He finished at Lancaster High School. After the war, he did a short stretch in the service and came out on a hardship discharge, because by then, the family situation had shifted in the way it so often shifted with these children. Spanky said later, without drama, that his father had essentially stopped working. The boy's income had become the household's income, and once a family reorganizes itself around a child's paycheck, it does not easily reorganize back. He needed a job. He was the most recognizable young man in Texas, and he could not get arrested. So he went to work. This is the part of Spanky McFarland's life that the nostalgia specials skip, and it is the most interesting part of him. He worked in a soft drink plant. He worked at a hamburger stand. He worked in a popsicle factory. He sold wine. He did oil promotion, which in Texas in the 1950s could mean almost anything. He worked for a bootmaker. He ran a barbecue restaurant and a nightclub, including a place with his own name over the door in Oklahoma City in the middle 1960s. And at one point in the second half of the 1950s, he took a job in Tulsa, hosting an afternoon children's program on KOTV called The Spanky Show. Understand what that job was. Every weekday, a young man in his late 20s sat in front of a studio audience of children in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and introduced films of himself as a small boy. He was paid a local television salary to present the work of an 8-year-old he no longer was, to children who had no idea the man on the stool and the boy on the screen were separated by 20 years and one continuous life. He received nothing from the films themselves, not a cent. Those shorts were bringing in money hand over fist across the whole country by then, and the man introducing them was being paid by a station in Tulsa to sit next to them. He wanted to grow the show. The station would not let him. Around 1960 he left, and then he found the thing that finally worked, which was sales. In 1966 he joined Philco, and he was good at it, genuinely good, and he rose through the company to become a national sales training director. He moved on to Magic Chef, and then to running operations for a furniture buyers association in the Dallas area before he eased into retirement. Here is the picture I cannot get out of my head about him. He sold televisions. That was the Philco job, selling television sets, often in bulk, to hotels and motels, which means that for years, George McFarland walked into showrooms and warehouses and lobbies containing entire walls of television sets, all switched on, all tuned to whatever was playing. And in the afternoons in that decade, what was playing was The Little Rascals, a man in a suit and tie, 38 years old, carrying an order book, standing in front of 40 screens with his own face on every one of them at the age of 8, closing a sale. He never fell apart, that is the thing. He had every ingredient the others had: the fame at 3, the firing at 14, the typecasting, the family that had stopped earning, the total absence of residuals while his childhood played on a loop in every living room in America. And he did not drink himself to death. And he did not go into a doorway with a grievance. And he did not vanish into a rented room. He worked, and he raised 3 children with his second wife Doris in Texas. And he made his peace with being Spanky by simply agreeing to be Spanky. He did the appearances. He gave lectures at colleges under a title he chose himself, A Little Bit of Yesterday. He turned up on the Mike Douglas Show and sat with Darla Hood and Billy Thomas and let a nation look at the 3 of them as adults. He was protective of the name and went to court more than once when someone tried to sell something with it. He ran a celebrity golf tournament in Indiana for years and gave the money to leukemia research and a children's hospital. In 1984, he stood on the stage of the Academy Awards with Jackie Cooper and handed an honorary Oscar to Hal Roach, who was 92 years old, 2 former Rascals in dinner jackets, in late middle age, giving a statue to the man who had hired them both and fired them both. He was still doing it right to the end. His last time on a screen was a small appearance as himself in an episode of Cheers in 1993, more than 60 years after he first walked onto the Roach lot. He collapsed at home on the 30th of June, 1993. His heart. He was 64 years old. The following year, they put a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame with his name on it, one of only 2 ever given to anyone from that series. 64 is not old. He is on some of the lists too, which tells you how loose the lists are, because a heart attack at 64 in 1993 was one of the most ordinary things that could happen to an American man who had spent his life on the road selling appliances. He never once said he was cursed. He was asked, and he had opinions about the business and about what it had cost, and he did not soften them, but he did not think anything had followed him. He thought a job had ended. When it was over, it was over. So what actually happened to the Our Gang kids? They grew up. That is the answer. That is the entire answer. And it is somehow harder to sit with than a ghost story would have been. They grew up, which is the one thing the audience never forgave them for, and the one thing the studio had no plan for, and the one thing the film they made will never allow. 176 children walked onto a comedy lot in Culver City between 1922 and 1944 and were paid a weekly wage to be exactly what they already were. And then every last one of them committed the offense of turning 12, and the machine had nothing further to say to them. Some of them handled it beautifully. Billy Thomas looked the business in the eye and walked away from it on purpose, and spent 30 years in a film lab, and died a man with a steady job and a son who loved him. Joe Cobb went into aerospace. Jackie Cooper ran television shows. Sidney Kibrick made it to 97. Matthew Beard went down as far as a human being can go and hauled himself back and gave the last 15 years of his life to warning other people off the road he had taken. Spanky McFarland sold televisions with his own 8-year-old face flickering on every screen in the showroom, and went home to his wife and children in Texas and did not complain about it much. Some of them did not handle it, and the reasons are not mysterious. Scotty Beckett learned at 4 years old that performing keeps the adults from falling apart, and he was never taught anything to put in its place. Carl Switzer had genuine talent and could not get anyone in Hollywood to look past a cowlick, and he died over $50 in a doorway, and he was owed a great deal more than $50 by a great many people, and some of them were simply taken by the century they happened to be born into, a glandular condition, and the medicine of 1935, 2 airplanes over Merced, a truck on Valley Boulevard, a hotel mattress and a cigarette, a bag of blood in 1979 that nobody could have tested, a stranger in Las Vegas who wanted a car. There is no villain anywhere in this. That is worth saying plainly, because the story keeps offering you one, and none of them hold up. Hal Roach was not a villain. He was better to those children than the industry required him to be. He fought a father in court over a child's money. He hired black children as equals when it cost him bookings in the South. And he told the truth about the whole business in 1973, when nobody was making him. He also built a system that used children up and released them with nothing. And he did it without any apparent sense that he was doing anything unusual, because in 1930 he was not. Bud Stilts was not a villain either, or at least not obviously one. He was a man in his own house with a stepson in the room and 2 angry men in his doorway, and something in him decided he was in danger. He may have been lying afterward. He had lied under oath before, but there is no version of that night where anybody meant for it to end that way. Even the people who built the curse were not villains. They were television producers in 2002, with an arrest in the news, and an archive full of sad clippings and a slot to fill. And the pattern they saw was real in the sense that all those people really did die. They just never counted the denominator, because counting the denominator would have killed the show. And the fans who have been passing that list around for 25 years are not villains at all. They are doing something almost tender in a clumsy way. They are refusing to let a group of dead children be forgotten. They have the wrong explanation and the right instinct. Here is the part that stays. Every single person in this story is gone now. All of them. Chubby and Weezer and Froggy and Bonedust, and Alfalfa and Slim, and Scotty and Darla, and Buckwheat and Stymie, and Spanky and Mickey, and Waldo and Specs, and Robert Blake and Jackie Cooper, and Joe Cobb, and Fern Carter who taught them their arithmetic, and Robert McGowan who shouted at them through a megaphone, and Hal Roach who watched some children arguing over a stick of lumber and got an idea. Sidney Kibrick was the last of the featured players, and he died in early 2026 at 97. And when he went, the whole thing finally closed. The films are still running. Which brings us back to the boy on the rug in his pajamas. On that Saturday morning in the late 1950s, sitting too close to the set with his cereal going soft. He is in his 70s now at least. He might be 80. There is a decent chance he is watching this, and there is a very good chance that if you asked him, he could still do the voice, and that if he heard the theme music, he would feel something move in his chest, that he would have trouble explaining to his own children. He was watching dead people and did not know it. He has known it for a long time now. And here is the last true thing, the one that took 100 years and all these graves to arrive at. Film made those children a promise, and film kept it. That is the rare part. Almost nothing in this life keeps its promises, and the camera kept this one exactly. They were told they would be remembered, and they are. They are more remembered than the presidents of their childhood. Norman Chaney lay 76 years in unmarked ground in Baltimore, and strangers on the internet who had never met him raised the money for his stone because a boy they loved on a screen in 1931 was still real to them in 2012. But look at the terms of that promise, because they are severe. The deal was that they had to stay children forever. That is the whole contract, and it was never negotiable, and it could not have been written any other way. The thing that made them immortal is the exact same thing that made their adult lives so hard to live, because a country that has decided you are 8 years old is not going to hire you at 28, and it is not going to stop loving the 8-year-old to make room for you. The gift and the wound were the same object. They always were. So when you put one of those shorts on now, late, when the house is quiet, and the picture comes up gray and grainy, and slightly too bright at the edges, try to see it the way it actually was on the day they shot it. It is a weekday afternoon in Culver City. The light is flat and hot. There is a man with a megaphone telling a small boy where to stand and what he wants, and the boy is only half listening. There is a dog with a ring painted round one eye. There is a schoolroom on the other side of the lot with a woman in it who is about to stop everything so a 9-year-old can finish his fractions. In a minute somebody will laugh for real, and they will keep it in. They are not tragic figures, not yet, not that afternoon. They are just kids at work, and they are having a better time than most of us had at our jobs, and every single terrible thing is still years away, and none of them can see it coming. That is who they were.